Afterword. More than a century ago, the first scholars began the attempt to translate the documents dealing with the Mongols and their time. Pétis de la Croix assembled Persian and Arabic texts in Persian. The gifted sinologue Abel Ramosat translated portions of the Chinese annals. Baron de Ahassan in Constantinople wrote the first connected narrative of the Mongol empires. Later, the first field explorers undertook their work of examining what lay beneath the surface of the lands. The Russians, Przhevalsky and Peter Kozlov, began with Radloff the exploration that had been left off by the Franciscans 5 centuries before. The work of this small group of linguists and archaeologists was carried on by others. The group always remained small, its labors exacting, and it became perhaps more truly than any similar group an international fellowship in work. Even the Scandinavians had their part. With the work of Sven Hedden and Kazaplika, a list of their published works, as I have collected them on my shelves, follows. I have little of the high qualification of such scholars. 23 years ago, while searching for more information about the Mongols, I found that the search always ended in the name of Genghis Khan, and that name in turn revealed little more than the figure of a frontiersman conqueror, or an inhumane destroyer of lives. On the other hand, it soon became evident that to his Mongols, Genghis Khan had been a demagogue, or as close as they had to a prophet, at least, right? Well, the soothsayers actually were, but at that time, I could not find out what kind of man he really was or how he had lived. In searching for more information, I became fascinated by the Mongol world. The quest for more knowledge had led inevitably toward Marco Polo and the Old Man of the Mountain and Xanadu. Xanadu? How do you pronounce that? And then to all the scene of medieval Asia. This proved to be an irresistible temptation to a storyteller. So, the greater part of the last 23 years has been spent in this quest for knowledge of the Mongol world. Being able to read only French and Latin at first, I had to learn what I could of the Oriental languages. Persian, which afforded some inkling of Arabic and Turkish. In South Russia, I made acquaintance with the medieval Ukrainian and picked up a smattering of Manchu Tartar, and now it was necessary to attempt Russian and Mongolian itself. Meanwhile, I have been able to travel over and examine more than half the lands occupied by the Mongols. In such trips, my work was made easy by the kindness of such well-wishers as Bayard Dodge and at the American University of Beirut and Itamad Aulat, the former Minister of Education in Iran, Persia. The great courtesy of Monsignor, now Cardinal Eugene Tisserant, helped my 2 years of reading at the Library of the Vatican. Such friendships have been an undeserved reward for work that must be lonely and often fruitless owing to difficulties. So, there was a name over here I kind of... Abel Ringnesat? Is that how you say it? In preparing this book, I am indebted to the skill of Marzia Gale in translating with me a large part of the Persian Chronicle of Rashid, with the cooperation of Professor William Popper of the University of California and of the members of the Archaeological Department of the Polska Akademia Umiejętności of Krakow, for their aid in finding references in the Polish ecclesiastical chronicles to the invasions of the Mongols, as well as information as to the little-known stone Babas. This aid was given unselfishly in the weeks when the Poles themselves were aware of the danger threatening them from the invasion of the Reich. Before then, at Leningrad, Professor Vasily Struve of the Institute of Ethnography kindly discussed with me the origins of some of the Turco-Mongol clan groups in Siberia, and made it possible for me to meet with the translators of the Institute of Oriental Studies. I am indebted above all to the findings of the brilliant linguists Eduard Blochet, B.Y. Vladimir Sov, and Vasily Barthold. The work of Paul Pelliot has cleared away many of the problems of Central Asia that defied lesser minds. The sources. It is only possible today to reconstruct in broad outline the lives of these Mongol Khans, these savages of genius, as Professor Vladimir Sov calls them. The details of their time and actions are scanty. It is necessary to disregard hearsay and depend upon established facts. These facts are, however, sufficient to trace, in shadowy outline, the personalities of the Golden Family and the consequences of their attempt to dominate the world. The sources yield us more detail for the descendants of the conqueror than for Genghis Khan himself. This record of their lives has nothing to do with present-day morality. They were nomads of the 13th century of the Common Era. They were influenced by their own environment and by the different cultures with which they came in contact. Modern militarists can see them a supreme accomplishment of warfare, and pacifists can visualize them as inhuman shedders of blood. I've only tried to draw the men themselves as they existed against the background of their time, as it was then. Now, as we know, in their time, there was plenty that, they didn't have quite the excuse that people said, well, in their time. People left and right were racist back then, and they'll be racist again pretty soon. Most people will be racist again in my country, and but it's just of the time. And it's like, well, you can judge people based on what they, you cannot hold, blood and soil or whatever against people until you kind of know. Like a Christian. Most of my country is not Christian anymore, apparently. All I know is that they somehow worship Jesus. If I hear someone's a Christian, that's all I know off the bat. So let their other beliefs and their other actions stand for themselves, right? Genghis Khan, Professor Barthold points out, considered the organization of the empire only from the point of view of the dominion of nomad conquerors over so-called civilized peoples, whom God himself had delivered into Mongol hands in order that they should derive revenues from the labors of the conquered, and for this object alone should protect them. Agriculturalists and artisans were to form the raw materials from which it would be possible for their owners, the Mongol leaders, to derive advantage. Chinggis Khan worked only for himself, his descendants, and his closest adherents. There is no evidence of any sort that he was open to the idea of laboring for the good of the whole nation. The terror caused by the Mongol attack, and it was caused deliberately, did not enter into their home life. It was a means to an end, a weapon to be used against the outer world. Within their own yurts, the Mongols were more often than not amiable, hospitable, and carefree. Assassination and treachery, and even theft, were rare until the influences of the outer world crept in after 2 generations. The discipline established by Genghis Khan over the new army was inflexible in its severity, but he schooled himself to exercise that same rigid control over his own actions. Chagatai and Kuyuk did likewise. Like all conquerors, Barthold reminds us, Chinggis Khan could calmly exterminate people by the thousands if he considered it necessary, but in none of his actions, of which we have at all reliable information, is there any sign of useless or stupid cruelty. Well, that doesn't mean that everything was necessary. His inflexible will stifled the emotions of those close to him, and his descendants reflected either that remorseless severity or the natural reaction from it. Chagatai and Kuyuk never allowed themselves to smile. Well, they probably did. And they inspired terror wherever they went. Others, Barthold adds, gave way to the natural vivacity of the nomad, manifested most strikingly in the desire to live and let live. They allowed themselves a gaiety that passed into debauch. Ugunai. This is the explanation of the Jekyll and Hyde conception of the Mongols that has persisted for so many centuries, wherein they appeared to outside enemies as a kind of demoniac invaders, and to their own people as inspired, if severe, benefactors. Even the Chinese, who both feared and understood Genghis Khan, admit that he led his armies like a god. Most cultures apparently believed in incarnated gods, so, that sort of thing. The Mongolian sagas. So we have in the accounts of the Mongols themselves, at that time, a record of the heroic type. Before then, the Mongols had no written documents. Their sagas are echoes of the spoken word, making no difference between legend and fact, and tinged with mysticism. Little of these early records has survived. The sayings of Genghis Khan, the Bilik, were written down probably by Uyghurs. Also, his commandments in the form of the Yasa. They were kept by members of the Golden Family and brought out to be read at the Kurilo Ta'is. They are all lost. We have only portions of them quoted by different chroniclers, and a version of the Yasa written by an Egyptian Muslim, Makrisi, 200 years after the death of Genghis Khan. A text and translation is in De Saucy's Christomathy Arabi. Christomathy Arab. A fresh translation was made for use in this book. Makrisi's version is colored by the author's leaning toward Islam. Or very often that's why people talked about tolerance of it. The earliest Mongol writing known to them as the Altyn Depter, the Golden Book, appears to be lost. Bits of it appear in the work of later writers. A later writing, again, apparently by the Uyghurs, had survived in a Chinese and Mongolian version. This secret history, as it was called by the Mongols, dates from 1240 of the Common Era. It has been translated from the Chinese into the Russian by the Archimandrite Palladius in Trudy Iskoi, Dukovna Misii va Pekinia, text of the Peking mission. The Chinese version is known, I believe, as the Yuan Chao Mishi. I was told at the academy in Leningrad in July of 1939 that a translation of the Mongolian text was being made by the Oriental Institute. This saga is in the nomad vein, with accounts of the individual exploits of Genghis Khan and his companions. It has apparently little to say about his descendants or the external wars after the first conquest of North China. A well-known Mongol analyst, Sanang Setsin, compiled a legendary account of the ancestors, the life, and the sons of Genghis Khan in the mid-16th century. It was translated into Russian by Father Hyacinth, and thence into a faulty German version by Isaac Jacob Schmidt. Chung Taichi der Das, 1829. It is distorted by Buddhist myths, yet gives many traditional details of the struggle of Genghis Khan against his enemies. The Chinese histories and travelers. The Chinese point of view was quite different from that of the Mongols themselves. They saw the Mongols in perspective as nomad invaders. They were under fear of the Mongol attack, yet they understood the Mongol character much better than the Muslimin or the Europeans. Their Yuan Shi, or Annals of the Yuan dynasty, were compiled in the 14th century and has not yet been translated in full from the Chinese. A brief version was made by Father Gaubel. Historia de Gent Chiscun et de toute la dynastie des Mongols, théorie de l'histoire chinoise par Anthony Gaubel, Paris, 1739. I'm not good with French pronunciation, so I have made use of this version. It is accurate in the main and gives full details of Kublai's reign up to his death. The Chinese had almost no knowledge of the geography west of the Gobi region, so their accounts of events in the farther west, when they give any particulars at all, are apt to be a real puzzle. During the life of Genghis Khan, a Chinese envoy named Meng Hung visited him and left an interesting account of his trip and his impressions of the Mongol character. He observes the change from their nomad state, when they existed for generations without care, being sufficient to themselves. His journal has been translated into Russian, text of the Peking mission. Chang Chun, a Taoist, also visited Genghis Khan in the west. He was a friend of Yeliu Chautsai, and his journal gives a good picture of the Mongol roads. The Great Encampment of Genghis Khan, translated into English by Arthur Waley. Chang Chun, The Travels of an Alchemist, London, 1931. Tracks of some other Chinese travelers are given in Dr. Brichschneider's Medieval Researches from Eastern Asiatic Sources, London, 1888 and 1910. The most interesting is an account of the sort of Hodagu's journey, the Ung Kien Kong Mu, or History of the Imperial Dynasties, compiled by Si Ma Kuang, has a little said about the early Mongol rulers. It is available in an old French translation. The Histoire Générale de la Chine, traduite du Tong Kien Kong Mu par le Pierre Joseph Anne-Marie de Mauriac de Mela de Regi par ma le Roux des Hautestres Paris, 1777 to 1778. Biographical accounts of the Tatatunga, Subutai, Galileo Tsai, and Sartak have been translated from the Chinese sources by Abel Rimusat, Niviu Milanges, Asiatic. That's Volume 2, Paris, 1829. These agree very closely with Gabel's and Rashid's versions, the Persian and Arabic chroniclers. These differ markedly from the Chinese. The earliest Muslim writers saw or heard about the terror of the Mongol attack. They paint a horrifying picture, but it is a true picture. They knew less at first hand about the events in China or Europe, but they were cultured minds capable of fuller expression than the Chinese and Europeans. The earliest is the famous chronicle of Ibn al-Athir, who knew little of the Mongols himself but gave many anecdotes from eyewitnesses. The Tarikh Jahan Gushai, History of the World Conqueror, of Allah ad-Din at-Malik, called Juwayni, was written in 1260, and the author was an eyewitness of events in Khorasan and Afghanistan. His account of the Mongols themselves seems to be brief but accurate. His work ends with the coming of Hulagu. The greater part has been published in the Persian in the E.W. Gibb Memorial Series. By all odds, the most valuable work is that of the Persian physician Rashid ad-Din. His Jami at Tavarik, our great collection of histories, was made about 1300 under the direction of the Ilkhan Ghazan. Rashid, a gifted chronicler, had the aid of older Mongols who remembered the events of the generation before him, and he used both Chinese Mongolian written records, even the lost Altyn Depter, our golden book. So, he had a clear perspective of the events around him, even in Europe. His account of the sons of Genghis Khan are drawn apparently from the Mongol spoken tradition or writing. Often in his pages, he uses Mongolian words instead of the Persian equivalent. As in his names for the 12 beasts of the calendar, his descriptions of the tribes and ancestry of the Mongols, he uses their terms, Yusun, Uruk, etc., and he is very accurate in his family relationships, which the Chinese and Westerners never mastered. And there's something in preserving the terminology of other cultures, because in preserving the terminology of the other cultures, there may be information particular to their word in an area that will be lost if you don't, include such comments. And, a different idea of what's being said will be had. Upon Rashid's volume dealing with the Urdu of Genghis Khan, the earlier portion of the present book is largely based. A translation of the parts dealing with Ogadai, Tului, Siyur Kuktiti, Kuyuk, Mangu, and Kublai was made at the University of California from the text edited by Blochet in the E.W. Gibb Memorial Series. This text had many lacunae and errors, not all of them noticed by Blochet. I was fortunate in being able to discuss many points of this translation with the Oriental scholars of the Library of the Leningrad Academy. In the difficult days of July of 1939, they did not consider the Blochet text too reliable, and they were making a translation into Russian of the whole Tavarik from the Leningrad manuscript and photostats of several others. Rashid's history is the most detailed in the account of Hulagu's expedition and the affairs of the Ilkhans, This portion has been translated by Quatermira, Historia des Mongols de la Perse par Rashid Eldin Traduit Compagnie de Notes, Paris, 1836. The notes are valuable. In the introduction to his first volume dealing with the history of the Golden Family, Rashid strikes a modern note. Until this time we have had only unsatisfactory accounts of the nations of the Mongols, of the structure of their tribes, the events of the life of Chengiz Khan, and the reigns of his successors. The writers of these accounts have consulted only popular recitals, and have arranged those according to their own inclination. The small amount of actual facts they relate are denied by the princes of the house of Genghis Khan, and by the chieftains of the Mongol nation. However, we have in our archives of the Ilkhans historical fragments that are recognized as authentic, written in the Mongol speech and script, but few people have access to them. To place these materials in the hands of the public, our Sultan Ghazan Khan has wished that they be written out in historical form, and he has confided this work in the year 702 Al-Hijra to the most humble of his servants, Fazlallah, the son of Abul Khair, surnamed Rashid the physician of Hamadan. This servant has been ordered to consult. To round out these materials are the Chinese sages and the Hindus, a term for, for the 5 tribes of that region, but, the ones to the east and down across the Himalayas, right? The Uyghurs and Kipchaks who were at this court, and especially that great Noyan, Generalissimo, and Administrator of the Kingdom, Pulad Chingsong, who knows better than anyone else in the world the origins and the history of the Turkish peoples, and particularly of the Mongol nation, because few persons nowadays recall the events of a century ago, and the greater number of the younger Mongol lords have forgotten the names and the exploits of their ancestors. But now that the greater part of the earth is under the rule of the descendants of Chengiz Khan, and a multitude of learned men, of Chinese astronomers and historians, as well as Hindus, Kashmiris, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Arabs, and Franks, Europeans, is gathered here at this court, it is needful that I make an outline of the history of all those nations as well, and add to it an account of the lands they inhabit. Rashid was the first, but not by any means the last, to realize that, to write a clear history of the descendants of Genghis Khan, he would need also to describe most of the peoples and the territories of the world at that time. So he worked with his associates at his great collection of annals. It was to have been in 4 parts with a geography. He labored for more than 9 years, and he tried to make certain that his masterwork would be circulated among readers and preserved for all time. He translated his Persian writings into Arabic and vice versa, and he created a fund for recopying his books each year. In spite of his desire and all his precautions, much of his splendid work has been lost. When a grandson of Tamerlane tried to assemble a complete version a century later, he was unable to do so. This loss now appears to be irreparable. During the time Rashid was at work at Tabriz, another Persian, Fadlallah, surnamed Wasif, or the Praiser, was writing a chronicle that begins with the death of Mangu. It is known that the Tariq-e Wasif, it's known as that, and it is written in the pompous style popular in the Persian courts. Much later, Mirkhwand compiled his history of Genghis Khan. He seems to have used the works of Juwayni, Rashid, and Wasaf with bits of added material. His text has been published by Jalbert Paris, 1841. A casual examination of it reveals no original contributions, although his account of Kaidu is full and interesting. While the viewpoint of the Muslim writers is utterly different from that of the Chinese, they make it possible to see the Mongols, as it were, with two eyes. The characters of the Golden Family become more rounded under their writing. They knew little, or cared little, about Chagatai Khans in Mid-Asia. Juwaini gave a brief account of the successors of the Chagatai, which has been translated by Defremery in the journal Asiatic 4 sur 20. It's